All right. So where we left off yesterday, we started talking through some of those theory bits. So we talked about kind of what is authentication, what is authorization. We kind of gave some definitions. We looked at some real-world examples of kind of what that looks like. Those are some things that we covered yesterday. We looked at also a few different ways of modeling, flags, roles, fixed grain permission, fine grain permissions, and configurable roles. Right. So we're kind of working towards that. The next thing we kind of talked about is how do we start implementing these systems. So we talked about that there's this sort of pipeline. If I go back to this page, remember we were kind of talking through the pipeline. You go through an authentication middleware, you have an authorization middleware, which can be one of many options, and then you're finally going to get to your route handler. And so we need to do various checks in different places. So we talked about this last week. We talked about different variations of this authorization middleware, yes or no. But we didn't get to talk about what actually happens here at that last stage. Okay. So we left off around page 22, 23, which was down here with the route handlers. So that's where I'm jumping in on page 23, is where we left off yesterday. So things to kind of recall is from that diagram is we're going to oftentimes need to do some checks in the route itself. And so what I want to look at is what are the changes, what are the updates that we need to do to our routes. Okay, so part of that just says let's look at where we're going to install those middlewares. So we're going to talk about that just briefly. Another part of that is how do we manage ownership, right? So if you have users, they can make posts, and you can edit your own posts, but you can't edit anybody else's. Those are things I need to block, but I also may have overrides like, hey, moderator can edit other people's posts, right? So there may be overrides for them. So the differences in question are here, they're highlighted. I did already start the Discord screen, if that helps anybody. But there are really only three things we have to do to kind of incorporate the authorization stuff, which is the good news, right? The amount of changes, we have to make more changes to our routes again, kind of like following along with what we did last week, but they're relatively small changes. So a few things I need to do is up in the top, remember that's where we previously installed middleware. I'm going to install an additional middleware. So for this route, I'm just saying that they have to be logged in. Because at least in this context, I said, well, you can edit it. It's either anybody can edit their own posts, right? So you don't have to have a specific role per se to edit a post. Does that make sense? The baseline requirement is just that you're logged in. And that's what we start out here, right? Whatever middleware you bring in is the baseline requirement, like the minimum checking that you can do. Does that make sense? Common checking that everybody has to have. So that's at least generally that they're logged in, but might be a higher level. So we say that. We also need to know the ID of that person that's logged in. So oftentimes that means pulling it from request auth underscore ID, converting that to an object ID. So we need to pull that in, but then variable make sure it's an object ID. Right? So those are two things we do. Then we get down here, and this is where we start dealing with ownership stuff. So typically what I want to do first is I want to go hit the database. I want to ask for that post, right? So I've got the ID of the post and bring it back, okay? If that post isn't there, well, we just finished where it worked, right? So the ownership checks we can only do if the document is there. Does that make sense? So they kind of have to come after the ownership checks. I have to do that first. Otherwise, this would throw an exception because the post doesn't exist. So we come in here and we say, okay, now that we check the post exists, let's check that you have permission to edit that post. So that can be, according to our rules, it can be the moderator. We also often assume that there's an admin. If you're dealing with roles, you also often assume that there's an admin that can do everything, even if it's not necessarily spelled out in the requirements. Oftentimes. So we say, hey, admin can do this. If they're not an admin, okay, if they're not a moderator, and if they're not the author, then you're getting there. And so kind of notice I'm doing backwards of what you might expect. I'm saying, what are the conditions that means that you don't have permission, right? So the reverse of that is you do have permission, which puts you in here and moving forward. The reason I'm inverting that is because it allows me to just kind of read the code from top to bottom. If I don't invert it, then it's like check if there's a post, do the update, and then the last case is what you do if you don't have permission, and that just becomes harder to read if you don't invert it. So that's important that we kind of invert the logic. So what I'm saying here, okay, we kind of think through this logic. If you're an admin, this becomes true. This becomes, right? If you're an admin, oh, yeah, that's false. If you're an admin, this is false, and you skip on right past, right? So if you're an admin, that first part will short circuit the whole thing, and you won't get through any of the chunks. Okay. Then I go say, hey, are you a moderator? Okay, well, if you're a moderator, again, you short circuit and go back, right? So these I'm kind of putting an override. I'm saying admin and moderator, they can do things, right? If you're neither of those two roles, then we have to check if you're the author. So here we finally say, okay, let's look at the post author. So post.author._ID. I'm kind of thinking about the post as having a nested author object with a nested ID parameter there, is the way that that database is structured. So if that's equal to, or sorry, not equal to, you'll notice a not at the beginning. If you're not the same person, you don't own the post, you're not allowed to edit the post. Right? So the simplest version, if there were no overrides, would just be this last part and not the previous things handed together. Okay? Things to note in there, you probably discovered this already. If you're going to compare two object IDs, you have to use equals. Right? So those are things to watch out there. Is because this is that. Another reason that I need to do the conversion up here to make sure that I'm in an object ID, so I'm comparing object IDs to object IDs. Otherwise, it won't work again because you have an object ID string. Cool. Does that kind of make sense? So this is like the main part of what we have to put into like the route. It's just to say, hey, are you the author? Is it assigned to you? You know, those kind of rules. And usually there's an override that says, oh, if you have this role or you have this permission, you can do it anyway. Does that make sense? At the data that you would normally have access to. Okay? Now, one thing to realize with this, note that if at any point if this system changes and I have a difference in requirements about who can do something or who has the override power, that code would have to change. Does everybody see that? So like if I change my mind and say admin can't do this, I have to come back and remove that one. If I decide that maybe there's another role that can do this, maybe there's an editor role now, I have to introduce that into the VS statements as well, right? So those roles are kind of hard coded in. Does that make sense? This is not flexible if I needed to have the user create new roles or change what permissions they're able to do. Is everybody with me there? Again, fixed roles are kind of the easiest place to start usually, but as things go on, you find that you have more and more code and there's more and more nuance to it. So it's usually easier than just go ahead and say, hey, let's make the roles configurable. So this is what it would look like if the roles were not. Cool. That's not going to work for us if we need that. So that's the last part, right? So you've seen what are the things we need to put in place to put permissions. Well, first of all, we've got kind of our authentication system that we've set up. We've got to add in an auth middleware of some sort, and that's going to fit in this pipeline. You'll notice I put it in before valid ID and valid body. Technically, you could put it in any order in there. It's just a question of what is going to give you errors. So this way, if you're logged out, you're not going to get any errors about like the ID being invalid or that, which is usually what you want. You don't want a logged out user to get any information about the system, even like what fields are required, if that makes sense. So we don't usually want to put that there from a security standpoint. Okay, so let's talk about how do we implement these configurable roles, right? We've kind of talked in general about how we do this, and I want to look at the process of what does it look like if we want to move to roles that are configurable instead of roles that are fixed. Okay, so we're moving the roles to that are fixed. Here's kind of how these things change. In a lot of ways, it's very similar, but just slightly different. So rather than checking that the user is logged in, I'm going to go up here and say, hey, they have a permission, right? Has permission, can edit post, right? So if you have that permission, you're allowed to edit posts. If you don't have that permission, you can't edit any post whatsoever. Does that make sense? So the first thing we guard is that. And that also, you can't have permissions if you're not logged in, so that also guards for anybody that's not logged in. Does that make sense? So it gives a baseline ability where we can actually say, do you have permission to edit even your own posts? Because we can turn that off and just say, hey, you don't even have permission to edit your own posts without changing the code, right? Because we can just turn that permission off. So oftentimes you have a baseline permission that lets you into the route in the first place, and then you may have an additional permission that gives you kind of an override. So in here, same thing, I need to pull in the author ID. When I do the check, this is where things are a little bit different. So I'm going to say, hey, we're going to still check that the author ID doesn't pass, but the way I'm overriding that is not by checking the role, is by checking another permission. Does that make sense? So you need this to even edit your own posts, but there's another permission here. We say can edit any post, which lets you edit other people's posts. Does that make sense? So there's kind of like two levels of the permission, right? You can either edit your own or you can edit anybody's. Does that make sense? Questions on that? Does that kind of fit in? So I'm saying request.auth.permission, checking there. This does presume, right? Obviously, we're looking at this permission thing. This does presume you have some sort of permission object within your token, right? That does presume that you have some sort of permission object within the token. Otherwise, that's going to crash, okay? So that does mean when we log in, we have to make sure that the user is populated with those permissions. Okay, so that's one task we have to do earlier up in the chain, is make sure that those permissions are set. Clear? And the simple approach, you're kind of thinking about fine-grained permissions, well, then that would be just on user object. But if we're doing the configurable roles permissions, we're going to see that's over on the roles, right? So we need to figure out how to put all that stuff together, put it on the token, but this is what that's kind of going to look like. Is everybody clear with that? The code change that kind of makes sense? So this is all you're going to have to do to the routes, right? This is all you're going to have to do to the routes. Find out if they have this permission. You're going to pick a permission and check up here. And for things that involve ownership, you're going to say, hey, either they're the owner or they have a permission that overrides the ownership check. Okay? And if they don't have both of those things, that's where we get an error message. Okay, so let's talk about the overall process of getting into configurable roles. So the first thing I want you to do is kind of go through and make a list of all the permissions you need and what each of those permissions does. That's usually where we start. Okay, we say, what are the permissions that the system needs? How take the actions that the user can do, break those into permissions. Oftentimes a permission may cover more than one action. So we're going to make that table, of the permissions, we're going to then kind of take what you started hopefully last night is working through that table and figuring out, roles versus permissions, which users have those roles. And so that's where we get a table like this. So they have different permissions. These are actually actions listed down the side. We want to actually get these identifiers. So we're going to kind of list the actions / permissions, and then we're going to list, these roles can do this, right? So that's going to give us what we need to configure the roles and to know what can do what. So that's the first part, is just coming up with that. And that doesn't really require code. That's just a matter of figuring out those details and largely from what the requirements are, right? So once we've got that information, we're going to take this table and we're going to put it into the database in the roles collection. So for each role we have here, each column, we're going to create a document in the roles. Everybody with me there? So here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 roles. So we'd end up with 5 roles, documents, each of those we have a permissions table. Okay. And so that would kind of look like this if you're looking at the UML diagram. So in terms of the UML diagram, it should look something like this, where you say, hey, the user has their role listed here, or array of roles. And then in the roles table, we've got the name of the role and a map that says what permissions they have. So if they have that permission, it would be like if they have can change passwords, it would be can change passwords. True. We only actually need to list the ones that are true. We leave all the ones out that are rules. All good? Questions? Does that make sense from a database modeling side? So that's what we're going to do. Okay. We then need to implement those middlewares we talked about yesterday. So specifically, has permission is the most important one in there, and then we're going to use that throughout the different routes. Install has permission and check anytime there's ownership. I need to put that on the list. Okay, so that's the overall process, and then you're done. I mean, that's as simple as it is. So the code changes, I would say, in some regard, are smaller than just the out of coding part where you have to figure out this table, right? You have to figure out how are you going to do it, right? And so I've given you a little bit of creative freedom, but we want to talk about that and kind of give some feedback before you necessarily jump into it. Okay, so some notes on how to write that list of permissions. So the place I would start is write down all the entities that are in your system. Namely, that's like all the tables / collections that are there. What are all the entities you have? For each of those entities, figure out what the actions are, and then kind of break those actions down into permissions. Cool? Okay. So let's maybe do an example of that with the pets, right? So we've got the pet store, right? What, with the pet adoption agency, what entities do we have with that one? What collections do we have so far? Okay, so we have user, okay? We have users, I think we call it. So we got users. What else? No, not issue tracker, just the pet adoption.
Do we have an appointments collection or not?
We did potentially at some point.
Yeah, we were talking about appointments and toys, right?
Yeah, we had appointments.
So toys are nested, I wasn't getting that.
Yeah. We did have those. I'm not going to try and talk about them because I think if we cover the other ones, we'll be there. What else was in there? pets, right? So we have pets, and most recently we added one as well with this last lab. So remember we were tracking edits, right? So we have another collection for edits. Okay. So from a permission standpoint, I don't need to worry about edits, because all we're doing is entering data, and we're assuming that you have, if you have permission to make a change in another table, then you just automatically get permission to add that change to edits. Okay? So we don't need to think about any permissions over here. And also because right now, at least, we're not giving the user a way to maybe view that data, but the way we view that data would be logically tied over with the permission over here. Okay, so edits I'm not going to create any permissions for, although I might create a permission to maybe view pet edits or view bug user edits and things like that. And I won't focus too much on there because I think just looking at these two will be enough to kind of figure out those. So let's start with pets. What are the actions that you can take with a pet? Okay, so you can create one. What else? Okay, so we can edit it. Okay, what else? What else can we do it? Well, we can delete one, right? So that's, always your basic actions. You could create, edit, and delete. And we can also view, right? Right? Sometimes you might have list as a separate, right? Can I view a single pet or can I list one? Sometimes those get broken up. Let's bundle those together. Okay, so you kind of say, well, both of those are reading the data, so we might put that under that, right? That can break up in different ways, but usually you want some permission in there to just control viewing the data, okay? Whether you call that view or read, or break that up into view and list, really depends on the application, okay? Are there any other actions that we can take? Pet adoption agency, I might have at some point I might have an adopt here, right? Or I might have a contact, right? Those we didn't implement in the system, but they could be there, right? So you could take those different actions, and so those are things you need to control, like who has permission to do those things. So everybody clear with that? Make sense? Okay. What about users? Is it the same list? Okay, probably, right? So I could say, hey, there's always, you're seeing CRUD coming. So create, edit, delete, view. That's a good question, right? Should there be a separate permission for logging? Perhaps. And so we might even say, sometimes you might break it out and say, hey, there's register and login. Okay. So I might have a permission for the admin to say create users, or I might have the ability for you to register users. I might have the ability to log in. Okay. Now, one of the problems with registration is really this can't be a permission, right? Because if you're registering an account, you don't have an account, right? Registration implies that you're anonymous. If I was logged in, I would go this route, right? I would be creating an account. I wouldn't be registering an account, right? So that means that this doesn't really fit into our turning off and on the register route doesn't really fit into our permissions. Does that make sense? That would have to be something that's like application-wide control. So if this was something we wanted to turn off and on, whether or not you can register, that would have to be something that's on an application mindset. Okay? Does that make sense? So that action wouldn't be governed by permissions. Now you asked about login. Okay. Could I give somebody permission to log in?
Yes. Two-factor.
Maybe. Don't they already have to but the permissions, remember we've said authorization and authentication and authorization, right? So we don't get to the authorization bit where we're checking permissions until they're already logged in. Does that make sense? So it doesn't really fit into our permission grid. Again, we'd have to use a different system to do it. And so typically what that means, we kind of talked about different ways to model it with flags and roles and different things. So typically to control login, what we do is we just add a Boolean flag to the user. And you say hey, this user is maybe deactivated or can't log in or whatever. And you just set that flag to true, right? You say, hey, they're deactivated, they're disabled. That's true. That stops them from getting here. And so then our authentication middleware would be the one checking that, not maybe, or our login process. Generally, our login actually would be our login page, because if you don't have permission to log in, you should never get a token to begin with.
Now, would that be different, say, the different users that log in against, a different homepage or something?
That would be something else and wouldn't be fall under, their authorization. Does that make sense? That's not a permission, right? The permission is about the things that you can do. What can you do and what can you not do, right? And so those kind of things, right? So if they can't log in, we would need to put a flag on the user, and then that flag would need to be checked on the login screen itself, right? You say, hey, you can't log in, your account is disabled. So that doesn't fit into the rest of the scheme. If we're talking about where you go, again, that's part of the login process, right? The login process says, oh, okay, your home page is listed as this page, and so it goes to the home page that you've saved as that, right? So that would just be another field on the home page. Does that make sense? Right? So we're specifically talking about what are the permissions, if that makes sense. So those actions don't really fit well into the permission system. They would need to be other things. Okay? All right. So let's talk about these permissions. Okay. If I have the view permission and that's all I have, is that sufficient? Right? What does this view permission say? All the users? So is there more than one level to viewing? There is, right? So what are those different levels that you could be allowed to view?
So view yourself,
right?
View everybody.
View yourself and view everybody, right? So you can have both of those kind of granular levels. You can also make it so hey, I can see everybody in a role or in a department. You could be more specific like that. But let's split it up and say, hey, there's really two levels, right? You can say, hey, we've got a view self, right, is one action really, and view any is really another action entirely. And so we kind of need to capture those as separate permissions. Okay. Now, I would argue that there's not really any place for this permission, right? If you've got a system of user accounts, it would be really bizarre if you can't view your user on user accounts. Does that make sense? So just like the other ones, I would actually just eliminate that one. Same thing with edit self, because if you should be able to edit yourself and you should be able to view yourself, right? You should be able to generally change your own password and those kind of things. So I'm not going to check those with a permission. Does that make sense? So viewing yourself that I want a permission because not everybody should be able to view all of the users. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, another thing to ask, okay, so this permission, we have view self, we eliminated that one, we said we don't need that one because everybody gets that one automatically, which is normal. You say view any. Now, what's left? View any, create a user, edit a user, delete a user. Okay. Are there any users that would have some of those permissions but not all? Are there any users in the system that might have some ability to do one of those things but not all? Huh? Okay. Well, they can't do any of them. What do you mean by that?
Like you wouldn't want everyone to be able to edit everybody.
So the way yeah. So the thing about this, yeah. So you're talking about edit any. I mean, these all become like create new, delete any, right? Because the kind of assumption is should be able to do self-service stuff if it's allowed, if we've implemented it. So really, we're talking about those kind of permissions. I would argue typically there's usually only one group of users that has that permissions. Usually we don't divvy up like the edit user permission and the delete user permission and the view any user permission into separate user groups, right? It's usually just somebody, right, if they have this certain role, can manage users. Does that make sense? And that includes all of those things. So what I typically do on the user side is I actually collapse this down and I say that we have one overarching permission. I might say, hey, they have a permission to manage users, right? And that gives you permission to edit users, edit any user. Sorry, I'll probably start with view. That gives you permission to view any user. It gives you permission to edit any user. Gives you permission to delete any user. So I classify all of those things under just that one permission. Just the manage users permission gives you the ability to do all that. Because there's not a lot of value into breaking it down much further, if that makes sense. Cool. So generally from a user standpoint, I don't break it any further than that. And the users is the exception to that rule, okay? So if we work to the table that we're looking at, so far we've got users making this table. I'm going to have customers. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So for users, we've got the different roles might be like customer, we might have an employee, and we might have an admin user. So we're thinking about this from the perspective of that pet adoption agency. So they're going to be probably a pretty small shop without too many roles, right? Unlike when we're building a bug tracker, we're thinking, man, maybe we're building for a larger company, so we have a few more roles. Okay, so we've decided from the user standpoint, the only permission that we need is manage users. And you'll notice I'm kind of writing that as an identifier because we'll end up needing to put it into the code as an identifier. So I'm going to count these. Okay, so next up, pets. And we've also seen probably the only person who's going to have permission to manage users is just that role there. Okay. Usually it's just one or two of the higher rules that's given that permission to manage your accounts, because there's a lot that you can abuse if you have those permissions. There's a lot of kind of privacy violations you can get into, so that should be very, very limited about how to do that. So now talking about pets, what actions do we have, right? So we've got the ability to maybe talking about the view side, right? What things can we do? What actions can a user take on this website? What's the first thing that they're going to do? Probably go look at the pets, right? So the first action, usually I actually start with the view permissions and figure out where to break that out, right? So let's think about this. So we have two routes, basically. We've got a list route, which lists all of the pets, and we've got, or lets you do searching, and they will also have a route to view a single pet. Like if I'm given their ID, I can view a single pet, right? So I've got two routes to deal with and a few different sets of functionality there. So for instance, ways I could break up the permissions, I could say, well, maybe a user can view the list but can't search it, right? I could divvy that up. I could say you have permission to list it, but you don't have permission to search it. Would that be a good division? Would that make sense? You're shaking your head. Probably not very useful, right? It's probably not very useful to be able to view the list without any way to search or sort it or what, right? Probably frustrate the user. So maybe like we could break it up at that level, and we could divvy those permissions up to search and list, but I would put those together, right? Because it just would be a usability nightmare. Same thing with like if you can search, you can view the list of users, but you can't search it, then there's a problem. So I usually bundle those together. Next question. Okay, so let's say you can view the list, right? What happens if we break the view the single and view the list up into two separate roles? Does that make sense? Would it make sense, or two separate permissions? Does it make sense for you to view the list but not view the actual object? You're shaking your head yes.
I think so.
Why?
Because then you'd see, you're talking about pets, right?
Uh-huh.
Oh, never mind.
Yeah, we're talking about pets. But what were you thinking about? You were thinking about bugs?
It just feels like there wouldn't be any need to see all the other users.
Okay.
But we want to look at all the pets.
Right. So different users what we talked about is self versus everybody else. Right? That's where the division was. And we said, well, everybody should be able to see themselves. Right? But with say a pet, right, it doesn't make a lot of sense to be able to view the list and then not be able to look at the thing that you just found in the list, right? That division doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So let's just say that that's all one button, right? So we call that view, right? So you can kind of see the naming convention that I'm going with. I take a verb plus the noun of the thing that we're working on, right? What kind of verb what kind of action are you taking, what verb, plus the noun? Cool. And so they oftentimes kind of fall into that thing. Or I might clarify a little bit. Okay. Next up, creating pets. Does that need its own permission? Probably, right? Probably. So we can use a bunch of verbs there. Sometimes you hear like this could be create, this could be add, this could be insert, right? You oftentimes hear all three of those verbs and they kind of mean the same thing. Pick any one of them, it doesn't matter. Right? That's one of those things that's just all of those names, really all of those words mean the same thing from our context. So you can call it any of those things. So view pets might be one, and then I might say add pet as another one. or add pets. Because I did that one. Okay, what would be my next permission? Well, usually I go down in order you look at it. So usually create, and then update, and then delete, right? So add pets, okay. Is there any way I could break that, would want to break that down further? Probably not. Probably you can just create everybody, you can create a pet, you can create any kind of pet. Does that make sense? You could break it down and say, hey, only some users can create dogs or enter dogs and some users can create pets because they've got, cats or mice or whatever you want to put in there. You might break it down based on breed or species because different people have specialties, right? If you have a dog trainer and a cat trainer, those are separate employees. You might break it down for them. But that generally doesn't need to be broken down as much. Edit, on the other hand, okay, oftentimes we do break the edit permission down, right? Because oftentimes you might be able to edit one thing but not edit everything. So for instance, you might have, with posts, you might have a permission to edit your own posts, but not permission to edit all of the posts in your database. That makes sense? So oftentimes there's different levels to that. Now, with this one, who owns the pets? Who owns the pets in this database?
The adoption agency.
Basically, right? The adoption agency. So our employees and our admins are all part of the same adoption agency. There's not a meaningful way to necessarily break it down here, right? With bugs, there is a meaningful way to break it down. Here, there's not. So what our permissions might look like, we might say edit pets, and we might say, we've also got like a contact. We've got an adopt, and we've got maybe delete pet. So we might start with those sort of permissions. Does that make sense? So I'm kind of defining what the permissions are going to do. Okay. So yeah.
So is the adopt pet, are we looking at that as like when we close like a bug the same way?
It's a good question.
And I guess the reason I ask is because I know with the pet adoption, you might not want to delete a pet right away because sometimes if they find a home, they bring it back and it's not a fit.
Yeah.
So you maybe want to delete over the adoption.
Yeah. So it's a good question. Who's doing the adoption?
The customer is doing the adoption.
Is the customer who's doing the adoption? Okay. Is that necessarily true? Could it be somebody else? Is the customer the only person involved in the adoption, right? Can they just show up at the adoption agency, take somebody out of the cage and go home with them? Take the dog out of the cage and go home with them? No, generally not. So who else is involved? Employee. So there's both a customer and an employee involved in that operation, right? So that's the thing, you have to understand who is doing it, right? And there's actually two people involved, right? Who gets sign off to approve the adoption? Right, it's the employee. The customer can't decide for themselves that the adoption is okay and it's a go, right? They can say, hey, I want to adopt this pet, but they can't actually do the adoption, right? It goes to the employee and the employee gets to veto that.
So it'd almost be like you maybe want to allow the customer to request adoption and it comes in and then finish the adoption.
So you might break that up and we might say, I'll move some of this stuff around. So you might say, let's request adopt, and maybe let's fulfill the adoption. right? There's two parts to it. Generally speaking, I would break that into two routes, right? So I have one route where you can do the request the adoption, and a second route where you can fulfill the adoption. Does that make sense? So who does the request? Okay, so they have that permission. Who does the fulfill? Okay, it's a good question. So who's the admin? Okay, who's the admin? That's a good question to ask, because that's one of those things that people misassume, right? So who is the admin? Who could it be? Could be the boss, right? Who else could it be? Okay. So we've got the boss, the manager. We've got the secretary. Who else? Whoever's running your website, right? Your developer, your IT person, right? Should those three different roles have the same permissions? Probably not, right? The manager, the software developer, your system administrator, and your secretary probably should not have the same permissions. Okay, so that means that we don't have enough roles. Okay, I think that's one very common mistake. That is one very common mistake, is to conflate the boss with the developer. And people think that those are the same thing and they should have the same permissions. No, they're really not. They're really not. Okay. So let's break this up. Okay. So I'm going to say we're going to put the secretary, at least, I don't think I need a separate role for that. I'm going to treat them as an employee. But I'm going to make a separate role for the manager, boss, and I'm going to make a separate role for the sys admin. Right. So you've got your IT person, right? Your developer, whatnot. You've got your manager. So now we need to come back and determine who has what permissions, right? Okay. So obviously managing users, manager should have that. They're managing the employees. They should have the ability to add or remove employees or view the employees in the system. Hands down. Should the sysadmin have that permission? Okay. You're saying yes. Why? Except? What kind of error mistake? Say what?
I don't even know what system admin is.
So sysadmin is a lot of different things. It basically means of managing your system. So that could be the developer that's building the website and managing the website. That could be like somebody who's actually running the server architecture. Generally the IT department.
Right. So, like for instance, if the manager would delete it, something like that by accident, you need someone to come back in
and fix it. Right. Those kind of things. Or maybe you have one of your employees, the most common one is employees forgot their password, right? If somebody needs a password reset, who do you call first? You call the sysadmin. You usually skip past the manager and go straight to the sysadmin if you need a password reset. And so password reset would fit in here. But it's kind of weird, so they should get password reset functionalities and things like that. You may or may not want them adding or removing users, though, because technically, who does the firing and the hiring? Does the developer do the firing and the hiring? Do they hire employees or fire employees? Technically, they don't, right? Technically, they don't. So this is more in his purvey or their purvey, not necessarily in this purvey, most of the time, right? So they basically only get to do things at the liberty of the manager, even though they're kind of running the show. Does that make sense? So you may not necessarily want to give this person full control because they're kind of underneath the manager in some way, shape, or form, right? If we talk about who's reporting to, right? The manager hired the IT person, not the other way around. The IT person did not hire the manager. The manager hired them, right? So there is a little bit of a conflict of interest there. But yeah, usually you check both of those boxes. Okay. Who can view pets? Everybody. Okay. Everybody can view pets. That's pretty reasonable. Who can add pets?
I would say manager.
Okay. Usually the way I try to do it is I step back and kind of try to hear from the business and find out, like, how does that happen, right? How would a pet get into the system, right? So if we step back and think about how the pet gets in the system, what are the steps that happen in the real world?
Kind of imagine an animal being brought in, and then they speak to somebody working. So that could be anybody who is not behind the scenes.
Right. Could be anybody there, right? So who are they probably going to speak to first? Probably an employee, right? So that's, if we're looking at who primarily is going to use these things, right? Those are the main point persons for these different kind of functions, right? Those are the main people that are going to use those things. Okay, but it could be somebody brings it in through, brings a pet that's in distress or whatever, brings it in through the back door, and the manager handles that. And then maybe they would do the answer. Okay.
Strictly speaking, the manager should have the same permissions as all the employees, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of an employee, so they probably should have an overlap there, right? Generally speaking, yeah, there should be some overlap. What about the sysadmin? Should the sysadmin be able to add pets? Why not?
Out of the scope of their job.
Right. They don't take in pets. They're not there. They're not there to man the front desk. They're not there to deal with the actual pets. They're just there to deal with the system. Right? And that's not their purvey. Right? In fact, if they're the IT person, they might only rarely be on premises. They might be working remotely. Right? And so that's not their job situation. Right? So they don't have that permission. What about editing pets? Who's going to do that, and when would that come up? Okay. You saying on intake? But on intake, we added it.
Well, I mean, if something changes, like maybe like medical record or something.
Okay.
You didn't know when they first came in. You might want to edit that.
Who's managing their medical records?
It's the workplace.
So workplace. But I would argue that edit is more likely to be the manager and less likely to be the employee, if that makes sense. Because usually they're the ones more modeling data quality, right? And so that would usually come up in a, like, hey, we entered the data wrong, or there's a problem with the data that we need to fix, or as you said, things change with the pet in terms of medical history or likes and dislikes or whatever it may be, right? So that may be actually could be on both sides. The employee could be doing that, the manager could be doing it, but most of the time it would be the manager.
I was just
Yeah, that's fine. So that kind of makes sense, right? So, and the same story here, like that's not the sysadmin jobs. So he's not messing with the actual data. So he wouldn't fit in. What about the request adoption? Well, okay, I think we've got that. And that should really only be, request adoption should really only be them. But we could argue that maybe sometimes if there's employees out, if the manager's running things, they might need to have that permission too. That's reasonable to think. But you notice the sysadmin now has different permissions than the manager, and that's part of why we wanted to split those up. Does that make sense? So this would be like your admin versus your manager. Does that make sense? Whether you might want to split those up. Because one person's the IT person, and the other person's actually the manager, the admin in some sense. Like this person's in charge of the actual data that you care about. This person's just in charge of keeping the system running. Questions? So does that make sense? So this is the thing that I want you guys to come up with, right? Is to build this grid out. And so we're going to take a pause here. We're going to kind of work through that, and then I'll talk a little bit about more. I think I have like one page left, 1 or 2 pages left. 1, 2, yeah. So I have like 2 pages left that I want to talk about, but I want you guys to kind of work with these first, okay? So I gave you those pages yesterday. If you filled them out, just pull them out and I'll kind of come by and look at what everybody has. If you haven't filled it out yet, please start that now. Right? So you're going to use the requirements from the first page. The first page tells you kind of what should be happening. The second page, let me actually pull it up. So this first page, if you're looking here, should tell you what needs to be happening. Right? These are the rules for the system. This is what we're trying to implement. You're going to fill out this table, like we did here, with what the permissions are. Okay, so we need to collapse that down from just what the actions are down to what the actual permissions are going to be in code. Who has those permissions? And then for each of these routes, we're going to put in a permission, a single permission, to say this permission gives you access to that route. Does that make sense? Because this is what you're going to put a has permission check at the top of all these routes. You need to know what that permission is going to be. Does that make sense? So it's not the action, it's not the role, it's what the permission is. Okay. All right, go for it. Yes.
Yes. So something, if you're doing a request out, fill it out. That should go under the system admin because it really wouldn't.
Oh, I skipped that. Yeah, that would be those. Because that would mostly be the manager taking care of that. That would fall under edit. It'd be about the same. Yep. Oh, I guess, did I not give you one yesterday? Okay, let me print you one out. Does anybody else need a copy? Okay. 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 So pages, custom, 1 to 3.
Mr. Smith, can I just ask you a general broad question?
Yes.
What is the purpose of viewing users in a business setting where you are managing funds?
You said viewing users?
Or listening, whatever terminology you want to use. What is the purpose of seeing who's registered in the application?
Right. So think about who would be doing it. It would be mostly the person that's managing the staff, right? So if you hire a new employee or you fire a new employee or you need to adjust their role, and maybe they move into another position, that would be where that would be.
See if they can see the change of thing or what needs to be.
Well, no, like a new person comes in the company, right? So you got a new developer, you need to add them to the system. Or maybe somebody needs a password reset, or all those kind of things, right? So it might be like HR, it might be the IT department, or it might be your boss, right? And so if we're thinking about the roles here, right? So you've got two kinds of managers. Product managers, product managers from product requirements versus the technical managers. You can't even hard side. So they would be the ones making hard side out of still. Does that make sense? So like managing users would largely be their purvey. That being said, even as a developer, I might want to look through the list and find and contact with them, right? Because I need to contact. That's what you can still flat base. There's plenty of reason for everybody to be able to read the list. That's what it does. That makes sense. Because oftentimes you're looking for other people at the company.
It acts like a directory.
Yeah, it's a directory. And that's how that would be used. And so you just have to be mindful that you don't want to disclose any information there in the directory that you wouldn't be okay with everybody in the business seeing, right? So oftentimes you might add a permission to say view private information, like you have that special permission, and then you can say the private information, like the salary. So like everybody can see the employees, but not everybody can see the salaries. Is a common thing. I plugged that in the wrong USB port, that's why. Yeah, it's not because you define that here, and it's like name the name that would be given a name. Yeah, without making what. So you got update. Yeah. So you don't really need to do yourself. Right. So this we can let's just draw on to that and say, hey, what is this going to be? Right. So as long as you're logged in, that gives you direction to yourself. Same thing with getting, you just need to be logged in. So that's not a condition. Yeah. Yeah, so this is, so can be users, users, okay. Okay. Now, notice here, looking back at the first page, just because you can edit a button doesn't mean you can classify, right? So this classification falls into what role? Yeah. Right, yeah. That actually should be on a different permission. Because it's a different role. If it's just on this permission, then you can't change the level. Does that make sense? So that needs to be different. Like classify, assign, and close can't just be that makes sense. Right. So you want to put it I guess that's a starting point. Let's leave it there. Change comments. Now, one thing I would kind of see is okay, who is editing and grading test cases? Pretty strictly the QA. So I would actually recommend combining those. Creating a test case and then making test cases don't really need to be separate because they'd always be the same. Whereas executing might be a different person. You might have one person creating the test case and one person executing it. You want to think about who would separate that from the other person. So that makes sense. So like executing might be a difference in JavaScript, but creating versus editing probably different. That's either way. You could break that up either way. I think we can do it. I think user, right? Versus user, which won't actually account for there, but we will so that one will actually create bug. So you want to do this in like a main. Okay, that seems fine. I would say that there's a few permissions here you don't have captured. So these are a little bit out of sync. I would ask you to get that. So if there's a permission that is here, also add it to this list. I would still assign a permission here for the making. Okay. I would still give that a permission. Even though everybody has that permission. One example of that might be you might have actually might have like the intern can't read everybody, but other people can't. Okay, so right, so like you saw we put like a view pass permission for section that you might say in features. I would just keep that short. Partly we want to keep it short because we're going to put it in the token, and so we don't want to get too much data into that token. So make sure all of the conditions are listed. Yeah, because you want to kind of start there, take all the permissions you have over here, and you need to figure out who has those permissions. Right, exactly. So you need your all of those chapters that who has those permissions. So short answer, developers are the people that are writing the code and fixing it up. Business analysts are people that are coming up with the requirements and saying how the software should behave, and they're usually talking to a bunch of people to kind of wrap that information. Right. So they're the ones punching. So they decide like what should the software do, what the plan is, when we do it, and if we do it now, we do it later. And so that means because they're deciding how the software should behave, they're kind of the gatekeepers for what is a bug in the business. So there's big people who be determining bugs. Determining should we fix it or should we not? They don't actually fix it, but they determine should we fix it or not. That's their job. Quality analysts, their job is to test it. So say somebody, the developer fixes it, there's a tester who comes in and say, or sorry, I'm going to test it. See if the fixes the changes that happen. If they're fixed, and they're also looking for bugs. That's the check if bugs have been corrected and fine. Product manager. They are generally working with the VA. They're also kind of in charge of determining what the software should be, right? What the goals are. They're usually at kind of a higher, almost like a different tier. So you have like the VAs are the ones that are usually embedded and working directly with developers, whereas the product managers are often maybe there might be one or a team of 20 or 20 people, or 5 or 2, or might be shared between teams. There's usually there's a VA for each. Does that make sense? Manager is generally what making decisions about what we do going forward. Right? They're less involved in bugs. They're more involved in features. Does that make sense? They're more involved in roadmap, planning the roadmap of the next 3 months to a year of like what are things we need to build and actually working with customers. Okay? So this is where whereas VA is much more tied to the nitty-gritty of the work. And then the technical manager, that's going to be somebody who basically does the hiring. He does the hiring and staffing, and decides what people we need on the team, what maybe a little bit involved in the technology choices. you spend money on this new version of the software. So does that help? Are we really active or are they doable or I mean doing like oversimplification? What you right now? Or I mean it's okay, that's fine. But so you guys kind of understand. Yeah, that's good. One thing I would do, you have to cross these out. I would actually line out two more because really that's just if you're walking. And as I was saying, they kind of doesn't make a lot of sense to split those. That probably would be why those two in this table. Okay, well, here I just say like if there were two routes, you get by name or you get by name, you probably get access to that. Probably get the information. So I wouldn't know. Comments. Yeah, it's really a simple as you can create comments outside of that. Same thing with word cases. So, in short, means that only pertinent is remember something called this data into that token. So, we want some short. Over there. The register should remember is happening before you're going. So that's not like a permission check. Because it's really like anonymous users have that. So it actually doesn't fit into. Yeah, but let's use it. You might say everything. Yeah, I would combine that with those. And so, yeah, you check. Yeah, sure, good. Just trying to figure out what permission to use. So you're saying that as far as like the name's going to be like a verb whatever. Yeah, it's usually going to be a verb. And I might add another verb in there, like say pay or sell or assign to author. And so when you were talking about like when they made your pathway, they said like maybe like the So because everybody can manage, everybody can do, but only the technical manager can manage. Right. Does that kind of make sense in terms of that? What you might do is just take what you have in parentheses, put the name of the resolution. Right. Okay. So view all users. I would combine these two. And you want to do that count case. So we're going to put in the count case very sense like that. Rather than splitting the string, just split it like this that way. So this is and so, like typically you can't, typically this doesn't make a lot of sense to split up and say, hey, you want to do, yeah, it makes more sense. Because if you're going to split it up and say you can only do some bugs, it would work more like you can only do the bugs that are part of your team or part of your department. It wouldn't be typically along those two paths. So usually some selection of bugs. Yeah. And so you're going to work that back in, like all of these permissions to your capture here should be back on.
Recently, if you don't have a role, you can't really do anything.
Yep.
Okay, so if your role is null,
Right.
you can't
Yeah,
see
if
the
your role is null, then the only thing you can do is like log in and change your account.
Okay.
Edit your account. That's it.
Gotcha.
Because the idea is somebody like the technical manager has to approve you, has to promote you to the role for you to then do it.
Okay. That's it.
And once they do, then you can.
Okay. Cool.
So how's your other?
This guy here.
Yep.
So I started out by not really making camel case. So
Okay.
And then, yeah.
Which
So
is
this is what
it's just what I would do is go back and kind of capture,
So yeah.
even maybe just put it in parentheses and say, hey, this is
There's a test cases.
Yep.
These folders can manage.
Yep. Exactly.
Okay. Gotcha.
Because the only division is remember everybody can see the test cases,
Right.
Yeah. And only one person and only QA can mess or use the test cases. So you probably do what, 2 levels there, like the view test cases.
Yeah. So I got the view on this guy.
Yeah.
Over here.
You just need to add that. Okay. Yeah. Back and say.
Okay.
That's good. Cool. That's the old one. Okay. Yeah, so you want to name the permission rather than naming the role. Oh, okay. Right. So yeah, you've got the role. That's kind of what you're going to enter here.
And this is more like the permission.
Yeah, you really want to know like what permission gives you access to. So like here, you're saying VN, right? But what permission that they have that gives them access to use? This is like close. That's what you're trying to capture. Because that's what we're going to actually do. We're saying has permission, close. So back here, so if you look at that part, you'll see that step 3 is to take this information and put it into the database. Okay. So you're going to go to the Atlas cluster and look now at roles and roles. Got it. And so that'll be the name of the role. You actually spell it out. You put the name of the role in there, and as permission given, it's going to stay there. And this is somewhere a separate collection name role? Or? Yes. Okay. Yeah. So our roles collection is that. So you get that finish up here. So go to Mongo and go to your Atlas cluster, and you're going to have the roles. And if you look at lab 5.2, this will be under step. Your pencil. You better start copying. I'll take you a lot longer if you start. So what you want to capture here, this is on the start. You want to capture the role that is permission. Right? It's control. Right? So, for instance, what's the action? Before that, what is that about? That's me. So you'd say list user right? And that's what you want to put down. Does that make sense? Right. That's going to be another thing. Right. You're just saying, what am I going to put in code? You're capturing comparison permissions. Does that make sense? So what you're going to put in the code is not the role. You're going to put the so let's put that in here. So what is that? What's actually those are all the first one will be this. So let's say new user candidates. So you're saying the same thing. And this one will be right. So that would be the part where you want to have now this thing is not you're saying everybody can update user and everybody, right? That's what you have to do. That's what they would do. That's what they would update or weakness now. Right. But what you want to capture is what the permissions are. And so if I look at this, you're saying everybody has permission to delete everybody else. So rather than saying that this is self, let's say that that is the second, right? Because when the product managers just deal with like planning projects, they're not internal staff, right? And actually, I would say nobody's creating users, so take that one off. Take that, replace that with something else. Well, you should be captured, right? That everybody knows you. Creators. That makes sense. Everybody you, but only your family. Does it say on the instructions? Remember you can capture the viewing, right? Not just edit. And remember you also have another action. How's that? So I've got that instruction. We want to see on the set. That creates the capture stuff. You can find that online. Any questions on that? It's sort of making sense?
Yeah, making sense.
Let me say like, what permission do you need to access that?
Standard getting.
Yep, just getting in there. That's all.
So go ahead and insert.
Yep. Go ahead and start creating your roles. So you have the structure pulled up, right? So you create it this kind of way. There's a name, and the permissions are just flags within the permissions operation. Yeah, there's probably should. I would combine add. I would combine add because those are always the same person. But I would say view is something else. Now, remember you're going to need to get that name. Okay, so what is the name of those functions? Execute test case, view test case, and what's the one from? So you might say view as and then because you want them to graph what are your inputs? So you got unzero for one. And so that makes sense. And so that. That matches up with your other table. But then, yeah, you can go to set 3 and just going to have something to add that kind of sense? Yeah, definitely. So you're creating and editing three actions. But those actions are all taken by who? So those could be create, edit, and delete could all be one, right? Because you're assigning them to the same version. Does that make sense? So you just have test cases. So you might have a few test cases and a name check. So like five all day. So everybody has to be permission to that. So so there's a few conflicting roles, right? So any user can edit the budget they're authorized. Any user can edit the budget they're assigned to, and then you can also reassign budgeters. So you can do a few things just by being like either the author or the assigned to, right? But you can't necessarily do stuff with every config that out of the box. So like business analysts get special permission that lets them edit any config. So there should be more than one. That makes sense. Yeah, it's not necessarily the field that like yeah, you're missing some permissions. So you want to split up update into right. Like update and update end. Yeah. That makes sense. Yes. Or assign and assign here. Or assign author or assign like you have one like can you update any, can you update once you're author of, and you update once you're assigned to. So those are kind of three different jobs. Same thing with assignment, all those different levels. So that's the second there. So how's that looking overall? Now, in your code, did you use the short names or did you use the long names? So you short. I would call this users, if you're going to call that. You're saying roles and users. I would keep the same organization. There is no two-way copy, so you're basically just going to export data and import it. So what you want to do is an export button. Export it. Full function. Export everything. Output. Just JSON. So what we want to do is create a new collection that plus and call it roles. And So you see you've got this table, right? So you use that table to populate the roles, right? So every role has a name and kind of table with permissions.
Oh, so this would be like
right? So you've got a bunch of permissions you can line out here, right? So you got like new list and new user, update users. So you add all those permissions. Does that make sense?
so the name of the role would be
It's going to be one of those. Okay. Right. So the name of the role would be one of those, and then the permissions you're going to pull from your table from steps 1 to 2.
Is there anything regarding the user that you will show to everybody else when you are looking at your site? Because that would distinguish whether or not you say, want to have a different permission for getting a user need.
So in that case, you would have like you would have maybe 2 layers of like can I view users in general, and then can I view their private information? And so you're saying private information also then on yourself. Okay. Well, what pieces of information do you have? Can you go back and look at the user?
Yeah. Oh, you want to know?
Yeah. Can you look back at the user? What data?
Passwords there, emails there, passwords not really there.
Yeah, password should be visible to anybody, even yourself.
Even yourself. Let's see. So email, your name.
So let's look into it.
And you've got role and that's it.
So role is obviously public information. Everybody kind of really has to know your role. Your name obviously is kind of visible when everybody you're working with. So that makes sense, right? So what are the things that are private?
Nothing really, because in this instance, our email will be work supply.
Right, work supply. So, and honestly, probably, even if it wasn't work supply, oftentimes you would need to use the email to get in touch with them about the goal outside of this. So if you didn't have an email, you actually have no way to get in touch with them. Does that make sense?
Could be able to name our lab and office space.
Well, what if they're working remotely?
Well, what's that from the office? Yeah, lab.
So no, there's not really any private.
But in some applications, there might be
scope
for that, right?
Yeah, there might. Yeah. So like there might be. Yeah, Facebook has a bunch of layers of like you say, hey, here are the things that I can see. Here are the things my friends can see. Here are the things my acquaintances can see. Here are the things that anybody on the entire internet can see.
only the DM and the
So there's a lot of different triangulation. But we're not. We don't have any private information. So, but that happens.
Okay.
Right. So it's not permission we need for this application, but it's not wrong to ask.
Given that, then, can I take the 2 you get here for users? And I think it's the conclusion after I decided to do it for fun. Can I merge these 2 permissions?
Yep.
These 2 and these 2, and so if you have just like 1 permission, you can list them all and you can do it yourself.
Yeah.
You can list them all for you to do one.
So I would say, can view user and can view all users. Yeah, that's fine. We combine those two. Cool. I wouldn't, because they're kind of very different job functions. So I would try to keep some of those things separate. So when we're saying classify bugs, what bugs are you classifying? Classifying what you're trying to, or are you classifying bugs? Yeah, so you would have assignment. So you're gonna have that level where uh, you're gonna have that level of like, okay, and what about adding because EA can do I think several of these things for every level. Like say developers and such and it's going to be assigned to the all work, right? So how do you capture that? Because that means you need more information, right? So you need an editing, but it also needs some more granular information, right? And then you also got author, right? Like you create it. So those are different kind of levels, right? And same way with assignment, right? Assignment, you have the ability to add things, and one might just be bugs that you're assigned to, it might just be bugs that you created, that kind of stuff. So there's also limits on who can assign different to what. Cool. Yeah, I was kind of looking forward to really just that way. Because that's kind of what I did. The game was, sort of, and this is, there's.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, when we're talking about editing bugs,
Yes.
from what I'm reading, it seems like your permission change as a bug goes through its life cycle. So it starts being authored by somebody.
Right.
And the author can inherently assign it to anybody and edit it again.
Yep.
But as soon as they assign it to somebody else, now that ability to assign is transferred only to the person it's assigned to and the business analyst.
Right.
So,
So like the business analyst has that ability that's at a higher level that they can assign any bug they want to.
and the authorship now no longer has any value because it's assigned to something other than them. They essentially just tag on as an author. That's all it makes. That's all it says. Actually, forward if it's assigned to somebody else.
Right.
So my question is, how do you implement that
Right.
in say What API bug API?
So what I would do is go back to your first sheet, go back to your other sheet, right? And capture those are, first of all, those are separate actions. Right? So you've got the ability to sign any bug, but okay, so you edit bug author only, so that's not any bug.
Yeah, it's just bug.
You're the author. So you cross that over date, that doesn't actually make sense. We also got a similar thing with, if you're not capturing about what about bugs you assign to. Well, that's different. I'm saying, so edit bugs. Okay. You can also edit bugs that you're assigned to, right? So that's a kind of separate part there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So assign bug.
Sure.
Whatever you want. I mean, this is just the description, right?
Right. So
That's what you're describing. The assignee.
Right. Yeah. So like you could say edit your bug assigned to only. If you remember that.
But they're not really editing, right?
They can.
So
They can actually edit. Because let's say you're a developer or only so you're looking at the bug, you may find that some of the information that originally entered in the bug was incorrect, or the steps to reproduce don't really reflect that. So oftentimes I need to add more information or update some information that's there once I'm working with it.
Okay, so this doesn't really capture what my question was originally, and that now that I've determined there's this assignee role, so that's none of them, theoretically, because it could be any one of them.
Yes, but it's a different kind of permission. So you've got three permission levels. So you can do edit any bug, you can edit if you're the author, or you can edit if you're the user. And the same thing applies to assign. You can assign any bug, assign bugs that you're the author of, or assign bugs that you're the assignee. That makes sense. So you also have to do that. Okay. So let's look at the edit. Right. So the edit routes. Okay. So what I'm saying here, given the information on the previous page, a table of which permission is required to access the route. Okay. So what is the base level that you need to access this route at all? What's that permission?
You can just call it candidate.
Okay. Right. So let's put that down. So we need to put that back here. Is there candidate bugs on this list? Because I don't see it. Okay. So let's put that in. So who, not any bug, right? Put it in literally as you've written it on the page. So what you're trying to capture is the actual name of the information. So you called it can edit bugs. You need to name it the same way. So what you're trying to get to this is something you can actually put into the database. So you need to capture what are those permissions that you actually need and who has those permissions. So can edit bug, who has that permission?
It's no particular role. You can't say all devs can edit bugs. You can't say all students can edit bugs.
But the way you define that permission, right, the permission that lets you get into there is you could potentially edit a bug. So we usually have two levels, like, which is what you kind of saw at the example. We usually have like, here's your base, right? You can't edit the bug. And then we add another permission to say, well, which one like override? Like maybe you can edit posts, which just gives you permission to edit your own posts. But you also need then like an additional permission to say, hey, you can edit posts that I
Cool. So then assuming you can assign it to anybody, and everybody going to have permission.
Right. So that's what we do for this. Is everyone has that permission. Everybody has that base level permission. And so then, like this would be edit bugs assignee, right? And edit bugs assignee. Who has
Yeah. Because it can be assigned to anybody.
okay. You look at the requirements. Okay. So what does it say?
Says any user can create a bug, but it's never assigned to the author initially.
Yeah.
We already decided this to be
Yeah.
anybody can make the bug, anybody can assign it initially.
Okay. But let's look at we're talking about edit, right?
Now editing it, now that it's been assigned, now they choose to assign it to somebody else, or the VA assigns it to somebody else.
So who's allowed to edit a bug?
Now we're looking at editing. So it says your bugs can also be edited by the user they are assigned to.
And before that, it said any user can edit a bug that they are author of. Right? So inherently, everybody can create a bug and anybody can edit a bug that they are author of. So this is true. And we also said anybody, if they're assigned to, then also. So that also means that one is wrong. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's put that. Let's go there.
And by the way, this tells me that there are two people at any given moment.
Right, they can edit
The
the bug.
author and the assigned.
Yeah. And there's actually three because the VA can also.
They can edit it, or they can only assign it and classify it. I
And
understand
the
that.
number 10.
Okay, fantastic. Great.
So there's different levels, right? Everybody is just going to authorize to edit it if they're assigned to it. Anybody who is. The reason we want to maybe capture those things as permissions is there are kind of like things you might want to change in the future. Like you might want to say at some point, maybe users can't edit bugs if they're assigned to, or maybe limit the roles that are allowed to do that. Right? So by adding the additional permission, it creates something okay. That makes sense. On the flip side, if given that those three are the same, candidate bugs, candidate bugs assigned only, author only, those are the same, you could collapse that into one. You could collapse that into one. And so you just say candidate bugs and candidate bugs. Like you could collapse that into two permissions. Does that make sense?
Say the second one again, can edit bugs and what?
Well, look at those three. Candidate bugs, edit your bug, edit your bug. All three of those, everybody has. It could be the same permission.
Yeah, they can be the same permission.
They could be the same permission. That's perfectly fine. Does that make sense?
So I feel like my question still remains, how do you dynamically capture the fact that the person's roles are changing, or permissions are changing?
So,
even though the roles are not.
yeah. So what you do is, first of all, we're saying, what is the base permission you need to access that number? Right? So if I don't have candidate bugs, I just get turned away at the door.
Yeah.
Right. But we're saying everybody has that permission. So then we go in, like, assuming we now have that permission, we go into the actual route handler and we're going to say, okay, get the route from the database and see if you can own it, right? Which ownership meaning either you are the author of it or you were assigned to it, right? So that would happen in the route. Okay. So right now we're just capturing what you need to not get turned away. Does that make sense? What's the minimum? And that's the permission scheme. Okay. You make notes about what those other permissions might be, if you might want those further, right? What are the other permissions that apply? But those would be checked later, right? So you might want to list all of those. Okay. Here.
Pretty good. Just looking, so the way we're doing it now, looks like any user can just sign the button. Just the sorry, okay. And then
yeah. So because the bug initially is going to become like you assign it to. The goal should what you want to change it to be is the author should be assigned to.
Okay. So yeah. So gotcha. So when the bug's created, there'll be the author and the sign. So yeah, I guess for each one of these, I want to add like, so for the VA, I added any bug, so you can go, like edit authored bug, edit assigned bug.
Yeah.
For each role.
Yeah, that's what I would do.
Okay. So that's what I think I'm missing.
Yep.
Other than that,
because you've got kind of three levels there. Bugs that you're assigning, the bugs that you created, and you edit the bug you created, and you edit the bug that you're assigned to,
or you gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So.
Alright. Other than that.
Okay, so it says in position 2, so go into your file. Okay, so unfortunately the way JSON works, officially for the JSON spec, you do have to use double quotes. Yeah, I did that. That's one thing. Yeah. So anytime you have a string there, JavaScript lets you use clear, but JSON is not that. The other thing that JSON doesn't allow you to do is any keys also need to be called. So like the name to the left of the colon, that also has to be called. Yeah. I wish that wasn't the case. JavaScript lets you leave those out in your functional, but JSON. I would go ahead and just declare one, and then give everybody as an input. That makes sense. Say, hey, here's the permission, but everybody has it. So the point number 5 says everybody can use the data, but I would go ahead and build in the permission just in case. Yeah. Well, I would still do one for each level, so users and bugs and bugs. I would still break up each. Yes, you could use the code, but usually you at some point also find different things. Right. At least you want to split up user data from bugs. Because users can kind of completely different things, but the bugs are problems. Test cases are kind of all in it. Right? So that's kind of all we're not going to think, but so I at least would want to be user data. Right, because the comments and test cases. Yeah, comments and test cases are kind of in their part of it. So okay.
these are what you have us at FBI. So we'll have it here, and we'll have it, and get test it. Yeah. Okay. So we're saying that okay. So go on to set 3. Yeah, which is put the roles in. So you're going to take the data you have here, right? That and use that to populate. Yeah. Good. So you recall to the next step. It's unexpected token colon, which is location 7 near death.
It's actually because you square bracket around the indentation of this. This is like the whole thing. Does that kind of make sense? People got there, but they put in there. Okay. So now you know what permissions everybody has. Okay. You want to change it? Let's change it. So then you go on to this. So take a look at this. Yep. That's going to be, if you pull up 5.2, did you touch that? Oh. You're right. You're looking at that. This is, you should have already kind of filled this out. So you're on step 3. So you're going to take this from step 1. There's one here. I think there's something with product. That looks good. And so this one classified product. That's the big that actually what one further now. Okay. Oh, I need these guys that was like, so we can call them, shift it here. Because you basically trying to keep your thought. So the one who's documentation says this is then format my by two. Just putting something. I would recommend now you only have to put the ones that are you can leave one of those that are false. And the code should work either way, whether it's there or not. But you don't need so it could become like that previously. We agree or waiting. So typically we want to look at all of these at once. So we're not waiting for the different ones to come through. And that makes it fun. So for the earlier there are some controls, you take it further. Right. Okay. Is that the only permission that they have? So your structure is install what you want it to be. Okay. You want this outer thing to be an object? No. So because what you have an array of objects, you just want an object. Otherwise, it's quite a bit slower to go. Yeah, so it's quite a bit slower to access and check permissions. And so that's, then you just want to keep that this one second. Cool. Otherwise, you have to loop through the array and then check this, check this, check this, and that. If you just make it an object like that, it could just say, okay, look up this key, and you really goes to. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So every time you generate a token for them, you need to give up the permission.
Even all our checks by the head commission are even, so we're not, we don't need to like that role.
Yeah, it's actually going to be. We still need, I think, is logged in for a few things. So I think all of it will end up being either is logged in or has permission. I think there's one of those routes explaining like if you're going to do yourself. Like viewing yourself and editing yourself, I think you just need to log in. Although I guess you could give everybody your permission to view it themselves and check that permission. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, you could do it. It just you would have to necessarily find the permission to check. Right. Because the way that that was written, I think it's got to that was just so. Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that one works if you don't have a permission. Because I think if you do this on fine and pass it, undefined here. I'm not sure. You're saying that undefined, that would probably be permission. Does that make sense? So, yeah, if you want to use that one for that, then you have to have a view of it. Okay, yeah. So consider a check, so you can check yourself and you can check that. So you're saying you don't pass it? Yeah, if you don't pass it, permission is again fine, so that, yeah. And so I think that we might actually I forget what happened to the pass it. Undefined as anything. I don't remember if you get a fine back or if it just says like so I would at least break for this. Okay. I have seen that in my point of view. I haven't really used it too much myself. I haven't preferred it myself. Feel free to play around with it if you want to. If it makes life easier for you. We'll put those as separate files. Right? So you're going to have a few anywhere when you create that folder. So you're going to have four new files in that folder. Well, yeah. You'll have more. Yeah, when you put it in the database, you only do this. That's what this is. That's what we're trying to do with this. That true rest. As you know, right. Because I have to. Permissions. Granted permission. But if you're up to the machine, that would include. So let's see. Oh, okay. So, because I was kind of confused, like, is this like some document? It's going to create its own document, its own collection. Right? So we're having a collection of roles. It's like dev is a document in that collection. Over you follow so I'm going to have an array of roles. With, the user has an array of roles. Okay. The user has an array of roles. So that would be here, role, which is that array. And we're just storing the name of the roles. That's where it all is stored. It's not the roles themselves. Otherwise, people get data you just want the name of the roles. And then you go here, we're going to say, okay, that roles in general have all of these functions. Oh, but they're not all of them that have all of them. Right, they may or may not have all of these, but these are all possible roles. That's what is kind of on that. Okay. So, like if we look here, the example I showed, so you've got all of these different functions. Could have in the logging example, they could have the example of a profile. Could be able to change emails, could be able to change traffic. That doesn't mean have. It just means that you could. Okay, right. I don't think they really. I don't think I use any dependencies for this. Right. You would put a middleware.
50 is one, but now we're looking at training. Yeah, let's keep that. So if you go back to work, right, so you would have that to where we want to have that. You're going to have that. We just want to say, you're not looking, you can't see. So you just, but thinking about what really, right, that you're creating, according to the table, you said that in order to create bug, you create bug function. So that should actually be have permission, create bug. Okay. So that makes sense to you. You would say, what's the one? And that's, what kind of access do you do that? So you have to do that. Okay. So if you just do has permission, remember has permission already checked. So those are built into all of those. So, it's never there's not been plus something else. So it's always just because that's a base requirement for any system. Otherwise, you'd always have to say it's right. You just have to be like that. Right. So there would just be this. Then the here is going to be explanation. So you want to go up to the top and bring down the step. But just looking at where you call it, so go back to the above. So you put in permission. And it's like that permission. Yeah, that's our oh, so you call it. So that's like the main operation. Does that make sense to you? If you're just saying, hey, you have to have this sort of all of you don't have a permission. And you can't have that permission. But it takes that chat. It's fine. Everybody's okay. Probably. Either way, I would recommend this way, because otherwise it's going to incur fees. That color scheme is kind of unfortunate. But like some things should be inverted and some things should, which are part of why you want like dark modes built in into your because that's always the problem with those extensions. You can't yeah, they're on the edge. The concept. I feel like there's some like I know I but this I really want it too. Finding it. So this guy goes somewhere around there. So that kind of makes sense what we're doing. So you get all the roles and combine them. So bringing right and rolling collection. So this code, I think is yes. This code has a problem in that it takes time. So oftentimes we want to remove all of the holes at the top. And so if you go on to the next page, that's kind of how if we say rather than getting one, we want to try and do all the holes at the same time. Yeah, so I promise all of this. Definitely take a look at it. Does that kind of make sense? Obviously, there's some intentions in there. So, like, if we just go read the original one, it just says the promise of all, so it's an array of promises. It says, verify me and all of it. So you say, here lady all this, and basically we're mapping from. So now we got the roles, and we map that to the promises, and then read roll. So at the end of the day, that's a really common trick. So now, children today have definition array, and that is checking the definition there. Super easy, we don't have to go through that combination again. Database is just it's an upload. Yeah, opt out permissions. So request all permissions. It's like, oh, is that what permissions are? So you want to do that for yes, registering one. Both of those. So that's all we have. We have to just change it. So we're in the whole. And the other range is your answer really quite good. change the text. Change. No, they do it, yeah. You took it as the same words. Yeah. So that means when you're in this chat, we're looking to aspiration. So if we look at the error message you get, so that you do not have any information, right? What generates that error message? So this one. So that's saying that the request to author permissions is that. So in your token does not list these type of permissions. Does that make sense? Yeah. The token lists these type of permissions. So you're logging around is what's happening. You have to log in around to build out those permissions. Using the token, it's looking at the token for permissions and saying there's so look at your login. So look at what's in the token. There are no permissions. So go back to the left. So it says refer to picture 26 and 27. So there's some information. Yeah, so for both those pieces of generating the token, we have the permissions to that. Yep. Pretty self-explanatory. Haven't touched on those.